and then Gwen will do the next part of this introduction. Rodemos el Diálogo is, or Embrace Dialogue, as we call it in English, is an organization that has been working for the last 8 years to try to understand the lessons from peace building in Colombia. Rodemos el Diálogo is, sorry for I had a background noise and now it's gone. So since 2012, we've been following the peace negotiations between the Colombian government and the FARC, and then following the implementation of the peace agreement that was signed in 2016. Embrace Dialogue is an organization that at the moment has different teams following the implementation of the work of the Colombian Truth Commission, the Special Jurisdiction for Peace, how the process of reincorporation of the FARC is going, the negotiations or the conflict between the government and the ELN on possible negotiations in the future. And the organization has been linking all the time with academics and practitioners in order to offer timely reflections and recommendations for policymakers to try to make the most of this window of opportunity of bringing to an end the armed conflict in Colombia. Embrace Dialogue follows 6 principles in all the spaces of dialogue that we organize, and I would like to share these 6 principles with you for you to bear them in mind in the next hour and a half that we are going to be here. The first principle is generosity. We ask you and we invite everyone to give the best of themselves in this hour and a half. The second principle is respect. We want people to feel that they're in a safe space to share their opinions and that their opinions will be respected. Third, honesty. We want you to be able to tell what you really think and what you feel about these complex issues. Fourth principle is co-responsibility. We believe that we all have a role to play in this transition in Colombia and that we can take new thoughts forward after listening to each other. Fifth principle is self-criticism. We all always think that it's important to reassess our prejudices and to realize the imperfection of our knowledge regarding these very complex issues. And the final one is solidarity. And perhaps the most important one in this seminar today, because solidarity with those who have suffered the violence in Colombia, who are seeking a better future and who are part of our society. So we invite you to embrace solidarity here. So with that in mind, I am going to hand over to Gwen, who is member of Rodemos el Diálogo and part of the academic team within Rodemos el Diálogo, who will chair this space and is the convener of this seminar series.
Thank you, Andre, and welcome everybody to the second in the series of the Embrace Dialogue Academia seminars. It's wonderful to see you all here in the middle of this busy term that you come and share with us this space today. And it's such a privilege to have with us today a fantastic presenter and a fantastic discussant. Thank you both so much for accepting this invitation to share this dialogue with us today. We're going to be having a presentation from Dr. Maria Fernanda Olarte Sierra, who's a Marie Curie Fellow at the Amsterdam Institute of Social Science Research. And her discussant is going to be Professor Lee Payne, Professor of Sociology in Latin America at St. Anthony's College here at the University of Oxford. A very warm welcome on behalf of Merton College, as well as Rodemos el Diálogo. This seminar series is a seminar series that Rodemos el Diálogo proposed as a way in which we can explore how to create bridges through dialogues like this one between academic research and policy implications for the challenges of peace building today in Colombia. So we're going to be asking some very difficult questions of our speakers, and I hope they will also give us some food for thought on how we can build those bridges and use our research to make an impact in what is a very complex scenario in Colombia today. So the format that we're going to follow is, first of all, Maria Fernanda is going to present for about 25 minutes. Then Lee is going to make her comments for about 10 minutes. And then I will open the floor to the audience for you to make comments and ask questions to both our speakers. You can either use the chat function to write your comment and question, or you can write in the chat, I have a question, and I will invite you to turn on your camera and microphone to ask your question in person. But please bear in mind that we're short of time and we want to respect and make sure everyone has the chance to ask a question or make a comment if they would like to. But you are encouraged to do so in person rather than me just reading it out. So with that in mind, I will hand over to Mafe for the presentation on the topic of forensic knowledge and transitional justice. Mafe, over to you.
Thank you so much. Let me share my screen. Well, thank you very much to all of you here sharing with us, and my heartfelt thanks to Gwen for this invitation of the Embrace Dialogue Academia seminar series. And it's an honor for me to have Professor Lee Payne to be my discussant today. As Gwen said, I'm going to talk today about the effects of forensic knowledge on victims' right to truth, memory practices, and the administration of transitional justice, which very much is what are the effects, the wider social effects of forensic knowledge in accounts and understandings of the armed conflict. Hold on. Yeah. My argument is that forensic knowledge practices, like any other kind of knowledge practice, is situated, partial, and performative in the sense that it helps co-producing the world, which means that forensic experts co-produce the armed conflict by the mere act of studying it. And this translates into forensic experts producing particular sets of victims and perpetrators. And in the case that I'm going to discuss today, these are victims and the accounts of forensic knowledge are set at odds to wider social accounts of the violence that has occurred. And I'm going to show this through an example framed in the Law 975 of 2005, also known as the Justice and Peace Law, through the particular case of a very uncomfortable body and uncomfortable in both forensic and social terms. To give you some methodological pointers, I'm going to present the analysis I'm presenting today comes from two different sets of data. One collected through ethnographic fieldwork from 2012 to 2013 that me, together with a research team, we did ethnographic fieldwork at the Attorney General Office, one of the identification laboratories, forensic identification laboratories. And the other one is fieldwork done in 2019 when I particularly revisited this case. Because both exercises have been done with people, I'm going to refer as we, because this is not my own and my single exercise. And I'm going to talk about a case that we found at a documental unit. And a documental unit is the file in which everything pertaining a particular case is kept. So from the exhumation order, every lab result, every piece of testimony of evidence is kept in one documental unit. And that is, everything is registered. So that's where we found the case that I'm going to discuss in a minute. For those who are not familiar, allow me to do an oversimplified overview of the Colombian armed conflict. It's a conflict that has lasted more than 6 decades and has had varied actors that go from the army and the state, passing through drug lords, the paramilitary, and different kind of political and narco guerrillas. But one constant that this conflict has had is forced disappearance as a weapon to control populations and territories. We know that since the 1950s, people have been forced disappeared. In 2018, the National Center of Historic Memory estimated more than 80,000 direct victims of forced disappearance. And something that is particularly important about the Colombian armed conflict is that the crime of forced disappearance is not limited to the state, but all actors have performed this crime. As I said, I'm going to talk about a case framed in the Law 975 of 2005, which is the transitional justice framework for the paramilitary of the Colombian United Self-Defense. So just to give you a brief context, Autodefensas Unidas de Colombia, known as AUC, were a paramilitary group. And they were paramilitary because they were not a group of peasants who were defending their land. These were groups of people who counted with the political and the economic support of some members of the armed forces, also of drug traffickers who were afraid of nascent narco-guerrillas, and also of landowners who were fearing the loss of status quo and threats to their land ownership. The AUC are known as franchises of death because they were able to establish a systematic model of selling uniformed and armed personnel, training specific methods of torture, retention, killing, disappearance, and burial. We're talking about a specific moment in the Colombian armed conflict that is from the mid-1990s till the mid-2000s, when the Castaño brother organized different paramilitary groups under one single that is called, as I said, Colombian United Self-Defense, from now on AUC, and Carlos Castaño became the political leader. The way they made sure to control territory and people was through, among many crimes, they were massacres and forced disappearance. The massacres were one of the ways to control territory, to arrive to a town and make sure people did what they wanted them to do. But after that, the massacre and the horrible crimes they also performed alongside started what is known as low-intensity war, which was characterized by selective assassination and forced disappearance. In 2005, Law 975 was enacted, and it provided a transitional justice framework for the paramilitary to demobilize and to rejoin civil society. The law supposed an important reduction of prison sentence, and if those who became forward the justice system provided information about the whereabouts of the people they had disappeared, among other things, but today we are going to focus on information about the people they had disappeared. And then postulados, who were these people, these demobilized paramilitary members of the paramilitary, when they went before the justice system, they were named postulados. And when they were there, they could told what they knew, what they remembered, and pretty much what they wanted. By 2012, the paramilitary had acknowledged more than 3,000 cases of forced disappearance. And the law stated that forensic experts of the Attorney General Office were in charge of doing the exhumations of the bodies they delivered, the postulados delivered. By 2018, more than 5,000, nearly 6,000 graves were exhumed, and more than 9,000 bodies were also exhumed. Exhumed, not necessarily identified. We'll come there in a moment. So you may ask, why is it important to talk about forensic experts, and if it's not already complex with what we have at hand? But forensic experts are relevant actors in any armed conflict, and for many reasons, and I'm going to give you three. The first one is that they help identify victims. One of the main roles they play is to identify victims of the armed conflict, different victims that this conflict produces. And identification is an extremely difficult task because it is the process through which a name and a life history are put together in a way that it makes sense. So just a name doesn't make sense, and a story without a name also cannot doesn't help to identify someone. In order to identify a person, the collective effort of the different forensic disciplines is required. So no single forensic discipline is able to identify a body. So forensic genetics alone cannot identify a body, or forensic anthropology. They require the collective effort. And since it is a process of making sense, a life history and a name, investigation is central, which means that forensic experts need to know, and they very much know, the dynamics of the conflict. In the sense that, as I said before, for instance, in the case of the crime of forced disappearance, all actors have committed the crime of forced disappearance, but the way they disappear people and what they do with their bodies is different. So forensic experts also know about the nature of the violence, depending on the different actors. So they are pretty much central, and the knowledge they produce is pretty much central. Forensic experts, since they are scientists, they are largely seen as passive witnesses who help read the marks that violence leave on bodies and on landscape, and then translate that to society or to judges, as if bones could talk. This is very much what we get from, for instance, TV series. But my invitation here, and what I would like you to walk with me and think with me here, is what if we think of forensic experts as active actors who not only read and translate, but they actually provide new elements that help nuancing our understanding and our experience of the armed conflict. And here is, and this because knowledge production practices of all sorts, not only scientific, are performative, which means that from a science and science technology studies perspective, we understand that the world is in the making. So the work is done through daily practices, of which knowledge practices is one of them. And they have world-making effects, in the sense that the world is not out there to be discovered by someone, rather by studying it, the world becomes to exist. This, I hope, will make sense shortly. This also is important because knowledge is situated. And by this, I mean that knowledge is produced by people with interests, with agendas, who are paid by specific institutions. And most important of everything is that they are located at a particular moment in history and at particular social, economic, and political contexts, which means that knowledge is partial. These grand theories, that of which scientific knowledge is very much in love with, these grand theories are not possible and also not desirable. And since knowledge practices have world-making effects, we can also say that they are not neutral and they are not innocent, because they have real and material consequences on people. And here's where the story comes in, and this starts to make a little bit of sense. And I want to tell the story about Lady. Lady is a pseudonym, but we wanted to keep the Anglicism of her original name, and so we wrote it down as it is written in Colombian Spanish. So we found Lady in a documental unit, as I said before, what it was. So we found Lady in a documental unit, and she was the testimony of apostolado. And the postulado, lady was part of the bodies that this postulado was presenting to be benefited of, by the law. And an exhumation order was issued, and exhumation party went to find lady's body, and the postulado went with the forensic team, which was normal. Postulados used to go to the exhumation exercises. The postulado very clearly remembered how lady was dressed when she was killed and disappeared and buried. And then the team went there and dug the body, and they found the body. Lady was a renowned sex worker. In the documental unit, it was registered that the material evidence found in the grave included a body wearing a miniskirt, a top, and sandals. And this is how the postulado remembered lady being dressed. Also, a rucksack containing 21 condoms and the identification cards of two men, Pedro and Aníbal. The forensic anthropologist, who is the one to do the exhumation, asked the postulado about the condoms and the identification cards. Regarding the condoms, he said, well, she was a sex worker. It's normal that she had condoms. And regarding the identification cards, I quote, this is what the forensic anthropologist wrote in the format of the exhumation. The postulado stated that the documents found in the rucksack may correspond to lady's clients. When they, the clients, did not have money, they left their documents as guarantee of future payment. So with this, they packed the body and the objects found with the body, and the body was sent to one of the laboratories of the Attorney General's office. Once the body arrived to the laboratory, the first one to be in touch with it is a forensic anthropologist who is in charge of cleaning the body and organizing it in anatomical position, and performs the first exercise, let's say, which is the individualization of the body. And that means to make sure that the bones are of one body. And so if it is my body, it's only my bones, so not another animal or somebody else. And once that is done, then the forensic anthropologist uses what is called in physical anthropology a basic quartet. It's a standard way of classifying bodies by sex, age, height, and ancestry. And through the examination, lady's body was declared by the forensic anthropologist as a male body. So he sent a piece of bone to the forensic genetics laboratory to make sure that this was indeed a male body. When the results of the genetic analysis came back, it not only confirmed that it was a male body, but also that it was Pedro's body. And Pedro had been reported missing by his parents many, many years ago, and in a completely different city. At this point in time, lady's story is forgotten. The datum that is privileged is the standard biological sex definition of Pedro, and the story that is tried to be told is Pedro's story, not the identity of lady. And lady just becomes a note in a documental unit. So what are the world-making effects of forensic knowledge in this story, no story of lady and Pedro? The one that is registered is Pedro, not lady. So the name that goes to fit the statistics of another man killed in the Colombian armed conflict and disappeared by the AUC and delivered in the framework of justice and peace is Pedro, which is an oversimplified story because we have no idea as to why Pedro is wearing a miniskirt, sandals, and a top, because that's not his story. That's the story of lady. And lady's story that is the story of a transsexual sex worker, is not recorded. And here we start asking questions. So I started asking questions about victims' reparation and the effects of this knowledge in victims' reparation. And we can say that Pedro's parents indeed received a dignified delivery of their son's remains. But we don't know, because it is not recorded whether Pedro's parents received information about why Pedro was killed. So we don't know if they knew about Lady's existence. We have no idea about what parts of the story they received. So one may ask, is just receiving back the remains of the son enough in terms of victims' reparation, or do we need a fuller story that help us make sense of he was killed? In terms of transitional justice, it's also relevant and important to ask questions, because the postulado delivered a body. It could have been anybody. The fact that it was a transsexual sex worker, and we know by social accounts of violence that transsexuals had a very, very difficult time, and still have a very, very difficult time in the Colombian armed conflict, is not relevant. What was relevant is that this man, he delivered Lady. If Lady then became Pedro, well, it apparently is not relevant. They could tick that a body was delivered. So finally is the question about the right to truth. What is the truth, and how can we relate to truth making in peace and justice, and through what the forensic knowledge can provide us? And we can say that in a story that flattens human experience, that simplifies the story so much that we don't ask why Lady was killed, but we only care about that Pedro appeared, we are left with a figure, but we are not left with a story. We have another man feeding statistics, but this bypasses, as I said, this bypasses the richness of human experience and set us even farther from understanding the many ladies that this conflict has claimed. It doesn't help to solve questions that talk about why particular portions of the population were particularly persecuted. For instance, the LGBTQ populations that we know are vulnerable populations are erased, as if Lady's story never happened. And here I want to make a disclaimer, because I know that forensic experts are faced with numerous contingencies, and they need to address a growing number of bodies that need to be identified. And also they need to respond and to accommodate to modes of knowledge that ask them to make these simplifications. So I don't want to say that this is the fault of forensic experts. I want to say that this is something that is, if we only follow scientific knowledge, we are left with very simple, plain, and uncomplex stories of the real suffering that people have gone through. On the other hand, cases like Lady are many, and for instance, since documental units exist and everything is recorded, we can go back and find these other stories and help making fuller account of the conflict. So just to finish, I wanted to show you through this example how the effects of forensic knowledge goes far beyond the identification laboratory and into the social realm. And it shapes our understandings, but also our experiences and our accounts of the armed conflict, while at the same time has particular and clear and tangible and material consequences on memory and commemoration practices, on the administration on transitional justice, and on the right to truth. Thank you very much. I look forward to your comments.
Amazing, Mafe, thank you so much for that amazing presentation. I have so many questions myself, and it's a topic very close to my heart, to see this dialogue between anthropology and transitional justice taking shape. But I will now hand over to Lee to help us answer the question, how can this research that Mafe has presented us with, how can we build from it and use it to contribute to policymaking challenges today in Colombia's transitional conjuncture?
Okay, thank you, Gwen. Thank you also for inviting me to comment on Maria Fernanda's papers. As I said to her before we began, this is a paper I really loved. So what I'm going to do is first start out by saying why I like the paper, our little love fest over the paper. In the second part, I want to say a little bit about scholarship, related scholarship, to situate Maria Fernanda's paper within a sort of broader scholarship around related issues. And then in the third part, I'll get to what I'm supposed to do, which is to say something about the practical applications or uses of scholarship in this particular paper. So to start out, just really briefly, what I love about the paper is the way in which Maria Fernanda talks about our sort of confidence and trust in science, science to reveal the truth. And, you know, the forensic anthropologists in Latin America are some of my heroes, right? And so it's so, you know, to begin to question the work, I think is a hard struggle to be involved in, because we trust so much in the truths that forensic anthropologists have been able to reveal about atrocities throughout the region. The second reason I really love the paper is that there's this assumption that we have that truth is neutral. Of course, we know that there are variations of truths, but especially scientific truths we understand as being neutral and not subject to the same kinds of unscientific emotions, taboos, moralities that miss or silence social reality. I think that is what's also very nice about the paper that Maria Fernanda wrote. The third part is a real, the way she exposes through this paper the disappointing lack of scientific curiosity when things fall outside the boxes, right? And I like that because she's showing how when things don't conform to, we might say, scientific or scholarly expectations, then they don't exist, right? Or they cease to exist. So I like that, digging a little bit deeper. And the last point that I want to really raise about the value of this paper, the beauty of this paper, is the process by which people get disappeared again, right? That Lady has disappeared again, maybe permanently, if not for scholars, scientists like Maria Fernanda, making her, bringing her to life, to reappear in this study that she carries out. And so that's a process of truth-telling. So within, moving to the second part, this is, reminds me how much I really love anthropological approaches the paper does, and it made me think of a few references that might be useful for the students in the scholarly community out there on how anthropologists have been able to expose what gets left out of the story, what gets silenced, and even through the process of trying to get it right. It's not necessarily malintentioned, but it's in the process of getting it right, what gets left out of that. What this reminds me of is Fiona Ross's work on women's testimony in the South African Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and how women were reduced through their testimony to the role of surviving spouses, surviving partners, surviving mothers, and not through their own protagonism in the struggle against apartheid. That got silenced in the notion of creating the figure of the victim, right? and the victimization. I also was thinking about the very recently deceased Sally Mary's work as a legal anthropologist on the seduction of quantification, right? Why, and I think it really relates to this idea of a registry, even though she's talking about a different kind of quantification, the consumption of knowledge for a particular end. And what is the story that is supposed to be told, and what gets left out of that story through the quantification of facts. I was thinking also about Erik Carlson's work. And I don't know if you've ever read the book he wrote a long time ago called I Remember Julia, or I Remember Julia. He was part of the SNOW forensic anthropology team in Argentina. The team discovers a person, they call her Julia for the story, and they realize that we found the body, but we need to know who the person is. And so they begin to do a series of interviews with family, with friends, people who are close colleagues of Julia or Julia, and realize in the end of this very long process, each of the chapters are the interviews with the people to try and make Julia appear again, that in fact, she's disappeared forever, that we will never be able to reconcile the contradictory stories that people have of who she is, of what she did, of what she even looked like, of her personality. And so it really shows the deep impact of disappearance, that even though you find a body, you don't find the person. So I thought that's another part that makes it very relevant. And I wanted to mention a forthcoming work by one of Oxford's own, Samuel Ritholtz, who is working on the AUC violence against the gay community, gay and trans community, not necessarily sex workers per se, but the attacks on the LGBT community by the AUC. He's doing his DPhil in development studies, so something to be aware of. But all of this is just to say that I really love the paper. I recommend it to anyone who has a chance to read it. And now I'm going to move to the third part, which is to think about how we can use the work that Maria Fernanda has done in this paper and apply it to try and advance the processes of truth and transitional justice more generally. I'm going to do this in the form of questions. Gwen wants me to give answers, but we can talk as a group about possible answers. So the first question is there a bureaucratic or administrative fix that you have in mind when you think about the limitations of the registry? Is there a way to register these kinds of truths within this bureaucratic administrative process? Because if there is, then in fact, what we should be working on is improving the registry, right? And that, how do we do that, right? So what is the process by which we, as scholars, can influence the creation of a registry that exposes these variety of truths that are otherwise hidden, silenced because of the limitations of a poor instrument? But the second question suggests that that's not really the only solution that you're talking about, because there are huge barriers just to doing that. And so I wanted to explore a little bit about what seems to be, but you don't state it very explicitly, a deliberate obfuscation of this truth, because it's a taboo truth, because it's an uncomfortable truth, because it's something that no one wants to look at, right? A truth that no one wants to tell. And so who are these truth gatekeepers? Using Jacqueline Baba's notion of gatekeepers, who may be well-intentioned. We're here, we're truth seekers, but we know society may not be ready for this. So we're gonna hold this back because otherwise there will be a backlash against us and against our work, and we won't be able to move it forward. So who are these gatekeepers, and is there a way to get over what may be not people who don't believe that the truth should be, this truth should be silenced, but who are worried about the backlash on the forensic team if certain uncomfortable truths, taboo truths are revealed? What do we do about that? Is there a way to begin to have some kind of dialogue as scholars about truth that are silenced in this, to do a sort of second round of truth telling, perhaps after the initial process is underway or completed? The third question is about the multidimensional approaches to transitional justice, which suggests that maybe there's too much of a burden on the forensic anthropologist to tell all of the truth, and that perhaps they simply have a responsibility, like as you are doing, of informing another body that could go into more depth, a sort of more qualitative approach rather than a quantitative approach to expose these truths. And what came to mind is a group like the Centro de Memoria Histórica, the Historical Memory Center, or even the Truth Commission. Right? How much are the Truth Commission working on these known facts about violence against sex workers? As you mentioned in your interview with Jaime Castro, this is not an unknown truth. It just doesn't come out in the registry. Right? And so who should be telling this story? Whose responsibility is it to tell these stories that the forensic anthropologists are not telling? Fourth, I want to question a little bit about the legal truth. As you mentioned, the postulado claims that he killed a woman. We then know from the forensic anthropologist's work that Lady was a man. What does that do to his testimony? Right? Doesn't that, in a sense, take away his participation in the Justicia y Paz process because he didn't give a full truth? And I just wanted to explore that. How are these benefits? Are these benefits ever revoked in partial truth telling? He helped find the body, but he didn't help find the person, right? The person of Lady. So the last question that I have is more around the ethics that you mentioned regarding the family, Pedro's family, and I really don't have any answers, but I wondered if you could talk to us a little bit more about, you say in the paper, we don't know what Pedro's family knows. Do we know that they returned the clothing to Pedro's family? Was there a process by which they could ask for more information if they wanted it? Is there any way in which a kind of more social work, psychological support for the family is provided so that it's not just here are the bones, right? But here is also the story of this person who mattered to you. And how do we go about thinking about those difficult conversations and the support that families may need to receive their loved one in this sort of coldly scientific way without the reappearance of the person? But thank you for a wonderful paper, and I look forward to talking more about this.
Amazing.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Lee, for your comments. And I think you've made lots of questions to Mafe. So while Mafe is gathering her thoughts about those, which I think they're really important questions because they're asking really, I suppose, about the practical implications or recommendations that you might make from your research, which is not usually something that we include in journal articles. So perhaps it's useful to push academics sometimes to think through, well, what would you recommend given that you found all of these things? But I think before I want to turn back to Mafe, I want to open also the chance to the audience to say any comments or any questions that they have. So do write in the chat if you would like to intervene, to say something, and I will invite you to speak. And while you are all thinking about your questions, I have a question for Lee, seeing as Mafe has already many questions on her plate, which is that I think Mafe's paper really made me think about what does knowledge do in the world? But in a way, also, I would like to ask the same question of the academic paper. What does Mafe's paper do in the world? What does Mafe's knowledge that she's producing from this analysis do in the world? And I'm asking that question precisely to follow up a train of thought which I have, which is the tension between questioning the work of the forensic anthropologists in Colombia with the incredibly difficult and challenging job that they have, and supporting their work, which is, supporting the ultimate objectives of their work, which as human beings, they're also carrying out in a adverse contexts often, especially now with polarization and increased violence and assassinations of social leaders and stuff. And I think, this is relevant kind of more broadly in the sense that academic and scientific expertise and knowledge is kind of increasingly under attack. We've seen that a lot with COVID as well, many kind of resonances there. But I guess I'm asking a question between where is the line between critique and criticize, and how can we navigate that tension in terms of what we choose to focus on and how important it is to focus on this topic, but also what are maybe the risks of poking holes, and how can we navigate those ethics? So that's my question to Lee. I have 3 questions of people who would like to ask questions and 1 written. So I'm gonna ask the ones because you're bored of my voice. So I'll hand over first to the people who are gonna ask their questions in person, and then I'll read out Borislav's question. So Andre, over to you, please, and then Jamie, Herman, and Borislav, and then we'll go back to the speakers.
Thanks, Gwen, and thank you, Lee, and thank you, Mafe, for fantastic paper. I mean, I guess I wanna build up on some comments that Lee was making towards the end, and linking that to something that you said, Mafe, that was that it's not the fault of forensic experts that this happens. Because then, what really I think that also Lee was hinting at is that the Justice and Peace Law was a very specific transitional justice process that had a flaw in the structure in itself, because it didn't have at the center restorative justice. And what that meant was that the victims did not have the chance really to engage with the postulados. And that was a very serious problem, a huge criticism to the Justice and Peace Law. And so, in a way, what I think that this reveals is that when you think that forensic experts are not part of a complex transitional justice ecosystem in which they need to interact with the victims, they need to interact with the other actors of the event of the gross human rights violation that we are dealing with, it is impossible that they can contribute to the aim of restoring the damage carried out by the postulante. So in that way, my question is whether in the case of the peace agreement with the FARC, that the unit of the search of the disappeared people has been created, this could be avoided. Because as far as I understand, and we saw this event last week here in our in Rodemos el Diálogo, where we invited a relative of a disappeared person, she felt recognized by the unit of the search of the disappeared people because she felt that she was heard for the first time. She could tell her whole story. And then I guess the unit of the search of the disappeared people could then take her story, took to the forensics, and then move on in that process. So would you say, Mafe, and with this I wrap up, that we have moved forward in a positive direction between the Justice and Peace Law to the current situation in Colombia, in which probably because of the restorative justice nature of the process, we're gonna get a better role played by the forensics?
Thank you, Andre. Jamie, please.
Hi, thanks so much for the great presentation, Mafe, and comments by Lee. I wanted to pick up on what Lee was saying sort of at the end of her comments, talking about what the family knew and this question about ethics, in part because this is something I found myself thinking throughout a lot of your presentation, was like this idea of, well, whose truth and for whom, and like who has access to that truth? Because I think I think that has serious implications for policy in terms of Lady as a person is lost, but if her family doesn't know that she's transitioned, has become Lady, and they may be grieving Pedro, right? So this question of like how much of the story is told in the individual cases, and what versus the full person of these disappeared people being told in terms of like Colombia's history and historical memory. I don't know if this came out as a fully formed question, but just the ethics of revealing these truths that victims may have wanted hidden from certain people. How do you sort of reconcile that when you're thinking about making sure that the full person is remembered?
Thank you, Jamie, and so great to see you here today. Herman.
Thank you, and thank you, Matt, for such an amazing presentation, Lee for great comments, and Wen for convening this space. My question for Mafe is, your research is, I think it's closely related to what Andre was asking. Mafe, of course, your research is focused on a previous peace process with the paramilitaries, with the AUC. And as Andre was saying, it's a completely different process for what we have since the 2016 peace agreement with FARC. If I'm not mistaken, the peace process with the paramilitaries left that forensic task to the Attorney General's office. So that's part of the ordinary justice here in Colombia. For the 2016 peace agreement, a special unit was created to take charge of this forensic task. So I was wondering what's different with this unit compared with the process with the paramilitaries. So as we were saying, it's not all about scientific knowledge, or there's much more about scientific knowledge than we could think at first glance, when we examine what a forensic anthropologist does. So does this unit, or does the 2016 peace agreement goes further to examine what's deep down, so social values in a society which is deeply sexist, transphobic? I know these are hard things to get to, but does the unit and does the 2016 peace agreement goes a bit further than the previous process with the paramilitaries? And if I may abuse my very limited power as host of this meeting, I wanted to ask Lee a question also. So of course you have done extensive research on transitional justice, not only in Colombia, but also in Brazil and more broadly in Latin America. So in terms of the transitional justice field more generally, where do you see these forensic teams or units as it was created in Colombia? Where is it situated in the toolbox, so to say, of transitional justice? Because it's not something that we think about usually in the field, is it? We tend to think about truth commissions and criminal tribunals, but the forensics are thought about as a very technical team that you don't usually associate with politics and the politics of peace, as Wen says in her work, because it's still deeply political, isn't it? So where do you see the situation of these forensic teams? I end up there. Thank you.
Thank you, Herman. I think that those are really important questions. In particular, for those who aren't aware, it's important to make a footnote here that the 2016 peace agreement with the FARC did have, as a world first in the peace agreement, a gender focus, which transversalized throughout the whole agreement, differential focus on women and LGBT communities, but after the referendum, one of the demands of the No campaign was to remove all mention of LGBT communities from the agreement. And so that was an opportunity was lost there, I think, really to incorporate a more progressive approach and a more differentiated approach to dealing with the knowledge coming out of a peace process broadly. And I think this paper really speaks to that that issue there. So I have one more question here from Borislav, which I'm going to read, who says, great presentation and topic, thanks so much. How representative is the case presented? Isn't it the case that the majority of exhumed bodies will be simple, so to say, that is telling a clear and non-contradictory story? Also, the production of the bodies is usually a very symbolic, in inverted commas, act, sometimes the only material evidence of the crime. So the accumulation of the exhumed bodies is a monument / memory museum of the conflict. So the individual by default is dissolved in the collective representation of the major political / social event. Sad, but perhaps still necessary and unavoidable. So there you've got some very challenging questions on the table. I'm going to turn back first to Mafe, then to Lee. If you could take maybe 10 minutes, Mafe, and 5 minutes, Lee, to try to cover as much of those as possible, but don't feel pressured to respond to each one individually, but as it comes to you and as you make sense of tying it all together. Mafe.
Well, thank you so much for all these questions and comments, and they help me think a lot. Lee, thank you so much for your comments and for the questions you raised. And I think that I'm going to answer some of the questions in a group, in a bulk. The first thing I want to say is that, yes, indeed, the forensic anthropologists and forensic experts are by no means responsible of getting this story out, particularly so because with regard to justice and peace law, all these were cases that went through, as Germán said, through the judicial system. So these were cases sealed. We don't know we know the name of Kelly, which is of lady, which is a lot. We don't know the real name of Pedro, and we don't know the name of the postulado. We don't know the other cases that the postulado provided. So we are not sure if it was a he, we know that, but we don't know if he got the benefits or not. So I'm not making responsible the forensic experts to tell this story, but yes, indeed, we need to build bridges in which this information can go into the public realm in different and well, not different ways, in some ways, because so far there are no ways. And I say again, it has to do, it's a product of where they are placed, these forensic experts. They are not allowed to talk about these things, and they have no time to talk about these things also. It's very important. They are drowning in work. But I do believe that there might be possibilities, and I don't know the answer, but we could think about it, of ways that the registry can become richer and fuller, and so information can be provided in a sense or in a way that can make richer accounts of what happened. We don't need the actual names of the people for richer accounts. This is important. People do know their own individual cases solved and addressed, but for memory practices, we may, the exact names are not necessarily that urgent for the collective, I would say. But since this was framed in the Justice and Peace law, it was a law that since the beginning wanted to benefit the paramilitary. So it was not relevant to know or to tell the story of Lady, and a lot of stories also were not told. And here I just go a little bit to Borislav's question and about the representativity of this particular case. Maybe Lady's case was one case or among few cases, but what we know, and I didn't address in my presentation, but what we know is that, for instance, rape was not addressed. And rape, these bodies that I'm referring to here, they are bodies that are already with no tissue. So torture and rape cannot be scientifically proven. Forensic experts they always made the annotation that it looks like a rape happened. It looks, for instance, in Lady's case, the body was gagged, and the forensic anthropologists made a note that it signaled possible torture. So because forensic experts are within this judicial system, and they are scientists, they can only talk about that they can prove. So they are very much in a difficult and tight situation. And that's why we need other people, special social scientists, to help recover these stories and bring them out, is what we did. So again, justice and peace was meant for the paramilitary. So I really hope that this new framework that we have in the agreement with the FARC-EP, that is looking at restorative justice and is looking simultaneously at the search of the disappeared, also the Truth Commission, and also transitional justice. I really hope that they really work together and produce, in terms of forensic knowledge, produce nuances and information that can help us make sense of what happened. Regarding Jamie's question about the ethics of what is to be told to the family, yes, I don't know. We also in the team, when we met Lady, we also were talking about that. Should the family know, or would the family would like to know, or they would just prefer to keep the story of Pedro, who went missing and they miss so much, and not the story of Lady? We don't know. And I think that's the job of articulated teams of psychologists and social workers who can work together with families. And I think the unit for the search of the disappeared is moving forward in the right direction of having these multidisciplinary teams to address victims, to see how much information they need and they want to know, because we can also not just tell everything because we think this is the truth, because as Jamie said, the truth, what truth, and for whom, and whose truth. I think that was it, but let me read at the question here to make sure I also, well, how the story is told, it really depends. So collective memory practices can look for collective memories and make this grand collective account of things that happened, or they can also try and focus on individual stories. And that is, and we will have to see the results of the Truth Commission and see which way they took or how they combine these possibilities. So I wouldn't say necessarily that it is unavoidable, the erase of individuality. Let me see. I think I tried to solve the comments. If I missed something and somebody really have the urge for me to say something about what they said, please raise your hand again. Thank you.
Thank you, Mafe. Lee, over to you.
Thank you, Gwen. Thank you, Maria Fernanda, and to all of you who are participating with this interesting exchange. Going specifically to Gwen's question about almost a question of the ethics of critique or the ethics of criticism. And I'll link it a bit to Germán's question to me about the role of forensic teams in transitional justice. I think that forensic teams have faced a lot of criticism in their role in transitional justice, and sometimes quite unfairly, because as Maria Fernandez's paper shows, they operate on very limited knowledge. They depend on the equivalent of the postulado, wherever they are, to tell them where there may be, and sometimes communities who come forward, and communities that come forward in very difficult circumstances, like in the aftermath of a massacre, that come forward and say, this is where you might find someone. And when they don't find somebody, then they get the criticism. Why can't you find these people? And an example of this is the Ayotzinapa case, right? The 43 students in Mexico who disappear, and the forensic team goes out to follow up on every lead of where they might be. And they find lots of mass graves, and they never find the 43 students. Well, who are in those mass graves, right? That's not part of their mission. But these are the disappeared in Mexico, which under the National Registry is up to, almost 100,000. This is part of the process of beginning to find out about disappearances more broadly in Mexico. And similarly in South Africa, as you remember, or as you know, the Truth Commission, the TRC, gave amnesty on the basis of a full disclosure. And one of those full disclosures, which is not unlike the justice and peace process, is that you tell truthfully what happened. And then the forensic team could go look for the evidence. If the amnesty applicant didn't provide full disclosure, then they were denied the amnesty. But the forensic team could not keep up with this. And so many of those who received amnesty, only later we found out that they did not bury the person in that place. There was nobody there, or a different person was there, et cetera, et cetera. So I don't know that I would say that the criticism is about the teams themselves, but about the limitations of the process. And I think that's also what Maria Fernandez is doing. I don't think she's so much criticizing the team, she's criticizing the instrument, the constraints on the teams, and maybe there's something there about what I was asking in terms of the gatekeepers, who's behind the process of trying to keep some of these truths under wraps, keep them silent. I would say, Germán, that in fact they have played the role more of experts rather than as a separate instrument or mechanism of transitional justice, that they work in collaboration with truth commissions, they work in collaboration with prosecution teams, but exhumations as a mechanism, I don't think has ever really been highlighted in transitional justice, but more the work of the different ways in which truths are told. There's a wonderful piece by an historian in South Africa where she talks about 5 different kinds of truth, and one of them is forensic truth, right? So it's not the whole truth, but it is one piece of the truth that is really crucial because it's the material evidence that something did happen. And in many societies emerging from conflict, that evidence, that material evidence, tells a truth that people don't want to know. What Maria Fernandez is looking at is a truth that people may still not want to know. And so even the evidence of what happened seems to be suppressed, right? At least in the official recording of the story of what happened. And that's problematic, and I think it may not be worthy of criticism of the team, but criticism of the process and how the team is limited by these constraints that are administrative, bureaucratic, perhaps legal, given what Andre was saying earlier. And I wonder if you could, Maria Fernanda, say a little bit about those constraints under which the team was operating in terms of revealing these uncomfortable truths.
Thank you, Lee. And before I hand back to Mafa, we've had one more question who I forgot to, or I didn't see his hand raised in the previous round. So I'm going to ask Jose to ask his question, and then we'll go back to, and if anyone else wants to speak, then please raise their hand or say something now. Otherwise, we'll go back after Jose's question to the speakers for their final remarks. So Jose, over to you.
Thank you. Congratulations for the presentation. I got some points since I'm a bit perhaps one of the oddities in this meeting because I'm a forensic anthropologist. So let me just raise a voice for my fellows. I got some comments. I mean, but some of the comments have already been made by many of you. But I think that is something that is quite interesting. What I see a difference that has not been studied perhaps between forensics working as part of the state in one way or the other and forensic teams. And Lee, you kind of hinted to that, but it's quite interesting because state organizations have this logic of compartmentalization by which forensic experts are seen not even as truth seekers, as technicians that will just go, exhume, put the thing on the table, tell me what it is. And obviously things as sex and gender, that would go beyond any kind of normal discussion. Is a man, because I got I don't know, a marker of melogenin that is a man and has to be a man. And the discussion doesn't go anywhere. So one of the main things is the issue of integration, because one of the logics at the moment of when we talk about identification, for example, is an integrative process that perhaps is the closest to any restorative approach that may serve the families in this process. Meaning it is not the forensic expert saying only what I found, is the context, is the witness, is the everything to try to get to some kind of factual truth in a way. And the other thing is that perhaps this derivation of forensics as such a truth-bearer, technical, factual thing comes from the changes that occur also in legal systems, by which we went from a heavy reliance on testimony alone, that is still the case in many systems, to a much more evidence or scientific-based truth in that thing. So the quality of material evidence had a much more important weight in the processes, but we have gone overboard. We should have gone to the other side, meaning I think that we as forensic experts could be overrated in many contexts. We are not the truth bearers or the discoverers or the bone talk, and no bone has talked to me ever, but I mean, I think that we have a piece. And the issue we have to look at here is the chain, not only one piece of the chain. But I mean, other than that, that's my humble comment. I totally agree with what has been said. Thank you.
Thank you, Jose. This is always the danger of doing anthropology, that the kinds of people who you study might actually be there to listen to what you're saying about them. And it's important to be able to, to talk back to them. Mafi, over to you to respond to Jose and to Lee's question and to make any kind of final closing remarks, if you could, in just a couple of minutes.
Okay, thank you. And thank you, Jose, for your question. And it is an honor to have you here and to have you hearing my work. So yes, to answer these two sets of these two questions, I want to say that I very much appreciate the work of forensic experts, and I work closely with one of them, and he has been my co-researcher for 4 years now. And I think, as Lee was saying, it's not something that they do wrong, is that the system in which they are immersed. And this links to Jose's point that we need to pay attention, or we need to know to which nature of forensic work we are looking at. So in the case I was presenting today, these are forensic experts who belong to a state institution, and they are part of the judicial system. So they have specific things that they can do and they cannot do. And they are required to do, and they are required to forget or not see. Whereas there are other teams, forensic teams that can fit sometimes, of course, to the judicial system. For instance, the case of oh my God, I'm going to say it in Spanish, el equipo forense, el equipo argentino de antropología forense, el equipo peruano de antropología forense, Equitas in Colombia. These are teams who can work either as humanitarian teams, expert teams of forensics who help make sense of what happened, but also they can help to judicial systems. Like, for instance, I think the Peruvian team is part of, or has supported, and also the Argentinian team of forensic anthropology, they have supported the case that Lee was mentioning before in Mexico, the Ayotzinapa case of the 43 students and all the disappeared people that appeared after that. So yes, they are not, by no means, they have to be responsible of the truth. But yes, they have a piece that needs to be there and that needs to be listened to and that needs to be recovered in a critical way. Not criticizing it, but in a critical way, understanding that science has its limitation and that science has its biases. And to address Lee's question on the gatekeepers, I think that here we are, in this specific case, we are placed at a crossroads in which there is a super strict bureaucratic system of what gets to be recorded in the record. So in a previous research, or in the research of 2012-2013, and we have a beautiful paper in Spanish about how information is being reduced. So you can have the forensic anthropologist's diary of the exhumation and of the case, and it's something very thick. But what goes into the file is 2-3 pages at most. And that, from there, they have to make another format. And that format is half of it, and half of it, and half of it, and half of it. And what the Attorney General receives is one piece of paper making a decision. So this is Pepito, and this was what happened. So the story is completely flattened. So one thing of the gatekeeping has to do with the format that forces, silences, as you were saying before we opened the room. But also I think that in the case of justice and peace law, it was not relevant, the story of the people. What was relevant was to show that the paramilitary were delivering bodies. So what was, the focus was on how many bodies were recovered and how many bodies were identified. The story of these people, who cares? We don't care. And that's why rape was not investigated. Only in cases in which the attorney who was in charge of the case wanted to pursue a possible rape that the forensic experts marked, only then it could be brought to court. And they could ask or not the postulado, and the postulado could answer or not, because that didn't really had an impact on the penalty reduction. It was a minor thing. I mean, it was not part of the agenda. So rape and transsexuals and gender minorities, it was not that they were purposely hidden, it was they were not purposely looked after. It was just not what was relevant. What was relevant is showing all these numbers and all these figures. That's what I would say. And just to close, thank you so much to everyone. I've written down all your questions and they help me think a lot about what I'm working on, and it's a wonderful material to continue thinking about this.
Thank you, Margaret. Lee, would you have a 1-minute closing remarks that you'd like to make?
The main closing remark is to thank Maria Fernanda for such a stimulating paper, such an interesting story, and the hope that this does begin to reveal a part of the truths that have not come out, at least officially, and may not ever come out officially, and how we can work together to support you and others doing this kind of work. So please stay in touch with us and keep us involved in your research and how we can do what I really love about the Rodeamos el Diálogo is really think about practical ways in which we can support these advances of truth and transitional justice in Colombia and elsewhere. So thank you for that. And thank you, Gwen and Andre, for organizing this event, and Germán for your technical support and participation. So thank you.
Thank you, Lee. So I'm just going to offer a few concluding remarks, both conceptual and logistical, if I may. And the first is that MAFE's paper is currently in process. So we are hoping that we're going to hear good news soon that it's going to be published. And I'm sure from the Rodeamos el Diálogo channels, we will publicize it as soon as it is. I'm sure all of you will now want to go and read the paper. So it is hopefully soon to come out of the oven. This discussion has really made me think of two things. The first of all is how much we need stories of the particular to focus on the collective, because quite often in stories of collective violence and the struggles of societies to turn the page on collective violence, we are so overwhelmed with numbers that we're not always able to focus on the dignity of individual stories. And I think that this paper has really highlighted to me how the particular is not just an anecdote. You know, it's not just about the value of the individual as an individual, but it also reveals the story of Lady Pedro, reveals fissures in the production of knowledge. And this makes me think about the role of anthropology. Not only kind of in two ways. First of all, the role of anthropology in working with individual bodies in terms of the forensic anthropology that is going on the ground that MAFE is discussing, and how those individual stories all contribute to a kind of global story of the conflict, which, as MAFE has shown today, is highly molded according to the parameters of science and bureaucracy, but also the role of anthropology as the story itself that MAFE is telling. So the kind of the anthropology on two levels in contributing to the stories that we tell about transitional justice contexts and how much that matters to helping us get a better picture of what's going on. And the second thing I want to end on is it makes me think of the role of outreach in transitional justice, which is a topic I've been reading about recently, as I understand it, quite an understudied and even underfunded strand of transitional justice frameworks. And the importance of thinking about what is information when we're engaging in truth-seeking exercises, whether those are judicial, forensic, non-judicial, historical, academic. What is the role of that information? That information is never impartial. It's partial in both senses of the word. It's partial as in it's always incomplete, but it's partial as in it's also biased, right? So it's situated, as you've explained. And what is the value of partial information, or what role does this partial information play in a context of clashes over the dominant political narratives? In a context like Colombia, which is so polarized and where there is a constant ongoing unfolding of what the novelist Juan Gabriel Vázquez calls the narrative wars, right, between the kind of political elites who seek to control the narrative of the public about what is going on with these transitional justice processes in the country, what is going on with the HEP, what is going on with the Truth Commission, and how the forensic expertise and knowledge that is produced by these forensic scientists and anthropologists and teams become little pixels in a big picture that these political elites are trying to kind of grapple with. And so then what is the role of organizations like Rodeamos el Diálogo and civil society organizations in trying to have a voice in that big political clash and actually offer our own interpretations, our own analyses of the information that is that we are receiving, filtering, thinking about, and how we can thereby seek to play a positive role in storytelling in our own way. And so with that in mind, I'd like to invite you all to follow our plug here for Rodeamos de Diálogo. We publish a series of snapshots. Herman has put the links in the chat here. We publish snapshots on 4 different topics. One of them is the search for the disappeared, the updates on the search for the disappeared in Colombia. One is on transitional justice, one is on truth commission, one is on reincorporation of the former FARC combatants, of how to keep track of and how to follow the updates in the implementation of the 2016 peace process in Colombia. And so these are an example, I think, of how academic expertise gets translated into a more information friendly or a kind of more accessible format for both experts and also lay people alike to follow. And so you can find us also on social media, on Twitter and Facebook. Those updates are shared there, but that's the website for finding our snapshots on those topics. And also just to invite you all to the next Embrace Dialogue Academia seminar, which is going to be on November 25th at 4 p.m. with Dr. Anthony Dust from Lehman College in CUNY in New York. And comments by Maria Clemencia Ramirez from the Institute, the Colombian Institute for History and Anthropology, where we'll be discussing Cauca, the role of coca and capitalism in the Cauca region. So another dialogue of anthropology and peace building, but on a different topic, on the issue of coca and drug trafficking. And with that, all that remains now is to thank you both so much for a wonderful discussion. Yes, Lorna, there is a recording of the seminar. It's on YouTube. You can find it on our website, not our website, our Facebook and Twitter channels will be sharing it shortly. I believe the YouTube link is also going to be posted in the chat in just a moment. I'm sure Herman can help us with that, where the recording will be available afterwards. And thank you both so much for your wonderful discussion. It was really fantastic, fantastic seminar. So thank you, and thank you everyone for coming. And I think if you could all maybe turn on your cameras and microphones and give a round of applause to our speakers, we might take a picture of everyone clapping them.
Thank you so much to everyone. Thank you.
Thank you. It's lovely to see you all. Okay.
Bye.
1, 2, 3, smile. There we go. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. See you all.
Thank you.